Can someone either in the audience or on Zoom tell me if they see the slides? I just want to make sure before we start. Okay, great. Thank you. So as I said, I'll give just a little bit of a background on the special section of the American Archivist Journal on Middle Eastern and North African archives. And the names of today's presenters are on this slide. So the American Archivist Journal itself was begun in 1938 with the establishment of the Society of American Archivists and with the establishment of the National Archives, NARA. They were all kind of, there's just a few years between the establishment, the need to have something to support archivists as a profession once the National Archives of the United States was begun. So I joined the editorial board of the Society of American Archivists in 2019, and in about 2021, the incoming new editor to the journal asked any of the editorial members of the editorial board if they had any suggestions or ideas for special sections. And I put up the suggestion of something about libraries and archives in the Middle East and North Africa. That there were three reasons that I thought this would be a successful or important intervention into the world of archival literature. One was to combat the narrative of just loss and destruction, which tends to prevail most discussions about the Middle East and North Africa in general, but definitely about documentary heritage and archives and libraries. And while that is one part of the story, it is not the entire story. And as someone who had done research on archives in the region, I really wanted to push back against that being the only story being told about archival and documented heritage in the region. I also wanted to humanize the region and its people, and for the Americans in general, but for archivists, since that's the group of people that I tend to be around. And also to learn more myself and to explain more about what was happening in the field of archives in Mideast and North Africa. So myself and Hankins, who will speak after me, joined. She was also a member of the board, editorial board, or she still is a member of the editorial board. I've since moved on, but we crafted a call for this special issue in 2022, did a lot of advertising for that, had a lot of interest in that, people just wanting to provide submissions for that, had about 13 viable articles. So no offense to anyone, if, viable meaning something that was ready to, that would need too much work to make it publishable. And that, we thought we could get it, have it complete by the deadline that was given to us by the journal. We ended up having 7 articles that were actually finished and ready by that time. So there are a lot of other things that we saw that were in, very important contributions that are out there that we hope will be published later in some other form. One thing that we asked for was that the articles would be open access. So I figured if we're writing about a region, it wouldn't be, and we're taking advantage of knowledge from that region, that we should also then be able to freely share that back with the region and with people who might not be able to do that. So that was what we did. And we also asked for permission if we could have the cover photo. If we could pick the photo, that would be the cover of the journal. Although it's a special section, it's not a special edition, so we didn't have not every article in this of this issue is part of our section. We are literally just a section of the journal, but we were given kind of carte blanche to pick the cover photo, and obviously we didn't know the timing, that by the time we got to this point, the war, the tragedy in Gaza would have started. So I can tell you quite honestly that in picking this photo, we are, it's of Morocco and North Africa, but it is reminding us of other, where it's helping us to think about other places. So that's all I have to share about that, and I will now pass it on to Rebecca Hankins.
Thank you. for this opportunity to discuss this special section that looks at the MENA collections. And I'm saying beyond because as Dr. Ahmed has noted, we hope that this will be the first of many. So I want to do a sincere and special thanks to Dr. Ahmed for saying yes to my interest in her excellent suggestion for this special section and her vision, diligence, and patience in making this series a reality. I want to also thank Amy Cooper Carey, who is the journal editor of American Archivist, for saying yes, and to Hannah Stryker, who did a fantastic job working with us on editing all of the essays. And finally, to our authors who submitted wonderful and impressive essays and patiently listened to our feedback. And also, as Dr. Ahmed is saying, we want to also thank those individuals who sent in thoughtful essays that we ultimately had to reject. And thank you for understanding that we had to limit what we could use. So I have a personal and professional connection to 3 of the archives mentioned in this special section. The first connection is that I was born and raised in Pontiac and Detroit, Michigan. So the essays written by Alexis Marks, Mason Christensen, Amanda Ford, Stephen Gentry, Ashley Johnson Bavery, and Matthew Jaber Stifler's article, Locating Arab Americans in Greater Detroit, an overview of MENA archives in Southeast Michigan, was such a reminder for me of home. The second connection was as an alumnus of Eastern Michigan University, my conversations with Alexis Marks. She is the University Library Department Head, University Archivist, and Associate Professor at EMU, is one that I will cherish. It brought back many fond memories of my undergraduate life at Eastern Michigan. My third connection was that I spent a month-long archival fellowship at the American Center for Oriental Research, which is what it was called. Now it's called the American Center of Research in Amman, Jordan. So that was in 2012, and I was their first archival fellow. Diane Ryan, Connie Manning, and I helped set up the archives of photographic, paper, and digital works showcasing the archaeological digs all over Jordan. So it was just an amazing opportunity for me and something that others in the archival and library field should consider doing these international fellowships. I was excited to see this place represented in Bradley Bauer, Samar Makati, Kaisi, Ryder Kuba, and Stephen Orgolo's articles. So forgive me if I butchered your name, but their article was titled, What's in a Name? Archives and Special Collections at American Research Institutions in the Middle East. It was such a pleasure to see that there. So, and conclusion, my 30-plus career as a tenured archivist and endowed full professor at Texas A&M University has been curtailed pretty much. I'm no longer in the archives, but still my love and passion for what I call the archival imperative has remained strong. Archives, history, heritage, and its modes and meaning undergird my teaching, research, and service to our global community. Dr. Ahmed and I look forward to hearing the feedback that will encourage continued engagement with archival communities in the MENA region and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rebecca Hankins. And now, for the sake of time, we'll move on to our first presenters, Alexis Braun-Marks and Matt Jaber Stifler. And I will be, give me one moment to just share their slides. And I believe that they should be visible. And I will turn it over to Ahmed of the Arab American National Museum, and Alexis Brown Marks, the University Archivist for Eastern Michigan University.
Thank you very much, Sumayya. I'm not able to move the slides, right? If we can proceed to the next slide, we can get started. All right, well, thank you so much. Alexis and I are kind of representing the team of folks from the 4 repositories located on this map. And we start with the map to give you a sense of, the community and archive, the relationship between the MENA community and these 4 repositories, which are about 40 minutes apart, from the furthest east one to the furthest west one, from Ann Arbor to East Dearborn. And as many of you may know, the history of the Arab American and the Middle Eastern North African American community in Metro Detroit is well documented. It's one of the largest and most visible in the whole country. And it's, very highly concentrated and tends to get a lot of attention and a lot of scholarship because there are so many different kinds of Arab and MENA folks located within the Tri-County area around the city of Detroit. And so what's really unique about this place for researchers and for scholars and folks to come is that not only can you come and experience the community, as like a tourist, a cultural tourist, or an anthropologist or a sociologist, but you can also come as a historian or somebody who's researching the archives. And it's very rare that you have access to the archives and the community in the same places. And so that's why we wanted to do this special issue to sort of highlight what we feel is a very unique area to do this kind of research. Next slide, please. So the 4 repositories we're going to talk about are the Bentley Historical Library, based at the University of Michigan, which acts as the University of Michigan's archive and also lots of state holdings for the state of Michigan. The Dearborn Historical Museum, which is a city-run museum in the city of Dearborn. My institution, the Arab American National Museum, which is a 20-year-old museum and archive located in East Dearborn. And then Alexis will be presenting about the archival holdings at Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti, which is near Ann Arbor and part of this Metro Detroit community. So there's like a timeline of these institutions and the things they collect and why they collected them. So the Bentley obviously has always been collecting from the University of Michigan, but then sometime in the 90s, it recognized that there was this large growing Arab and Middle Eastern population in Michigan, and it started to collect specifically collections from those communities. And it started its Arab Americans, Chaldeans, and Muslims in Michigan collection, which it continues to add to today. And this is a screenshot from the Wayback Machine. So if you're thinking, wow, their website is quite old looking, it's because this screenshot is from 2006. It was the year after the museum opened. So it shows the Arab American Museum. And so it shows that they had been doing this collecting pre-museum. I'll talk about our museum in a little bit after Alexis. But to situate, before the museum opened, there was no single institution in the region collecting the history of the community. So the Bentley stepped up and was doing a lot of that. The Dearborn Historical Museum has been around for a long time as a city-run museum, but they didn't really focus on their Arab American community in Dearborn until very recently, until actually after the Arab American Museum opened in 2005, and they started to partner with us and wanted to have their collections more inclusive of the large Arab community in the area. So just sort of situating our institutions, the 4 institutions, and once the Arab American National Museum was built, the Bentley still continues to collect from our community. EMU has active collections. Dearborn Historical has active collections. We don't see ourselves in competition with each other. We understand that no one institution can hold the diverse holdings of our large and growing community. So we like to work together. And I think the article was a way of showcasing that. I'll pass it off to Alexis to present about Eastern Michigan University.
Thanks, Matt. So Eastern Michigan University Archives was established in 1970. We are celebrating our 175th anniversary this year. So while we're a much older institution of higher learning, the archives itself hasn't been around for very long. I would say 90% of our holdings are institutional records, so papers of student organizations, teaching faculty, administrators, and staff. And about 10% of those records don't really fall into that category, but have found their way to Eastern through faculty that were involved in these various organizations. And one of those is our largest collection that we have, which are the records of the Association of Arab American University graduates. The AAUG papers are not the only MENA collection that we have. We also have a collection from some of the USAID project partnerships. One in particular was the Yemen project, where the College of Education was in Yemen from 1979 to 1986. So while we have the records of this project that took place in Yemen, as I mentioned before, our largest collection related to the Middle East and North Africa are the records of the AAUG. And I think one of the things that we recognized in writing this is that records have found their way to our various institutions in kind of roundabout ways. And so how the AAUG papers came to live at Eastern was through a connection to a faculty member by the name of Janice Terry, who was hired as the first Middle East historian in the Department of History in 1968. Dr. Terry had a long affiliation with the AAUG, and as they were closing their offices in Boston, transferring records to Washington, D.C., and then ultimately closing the doors to the office in DC, they had nowhere for the records to go. And so Dr. Terry, recognizing that there was this large population, not only of residents, but also scholars, offered up Eastern's archives as a potential repository. Next slide. So the AAUG, if you're not familiar with it, was founded in 1967 as a nonprofit tax-exempt educational cultural organization dedicated to fostering a better understanding between Arab and American peoples while promoting informed discussion of critical issues concerning the Arab world in North America. So one of the largest components, and this is a screenshot of our finding aid to the AAUG papers. They're within the series specific to the organization itself. There are records pertaining to the publications that they helped coordinate, as well as the annual convention and mid-year conferences that served as a forum for Middle East specialists and scholars from around the world. They would bring in speakers on topics concerning the Arab world and its people, and help bring its membered professionals skills to bear on socioeconomic and technological needs of the Arab world. Next slide, please. So the records and what we have found in regards to the scholars that are using our records is that it's a wide variety. It's not just publications, but it is also materials of past presidents of the organization. And so there's a lot of correspondence, there's a lot of individual notes, obviously photographs, audio, etc. And I know that Matt will speak to this a little bit later, but one of the things that I think was most interesting is to recognize that while we may have records of the AAUG, our collection is not complete. That there are papers of different AAUG leadership that are not only at the museum, but are also at the Bentley. And so there's a lot of crossover between our various institutions. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Matt. Next slide.
Thanks, Alexis. Yeah, so the materials that we have at the museum really reflect the diverse Arab American community and the long history in the United States. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we have, how we acquired it, and kind of what we do with it. So everything we have was acquired by donation from folks, in our community, families, the individuals themselves, and we have everything from pop culture representations like the Shaggy doll here, which, if you know, the voice of Shaggy was Casey Kasem, who was an Arab American, a Lebanese Druze, son of Lebanese Druze immigrants to Metro Detroit, and was always very in touch with his heritage, and supported the museum. On the upper right is a recent acquisition of two photo albums, personal photos of noted scholar Philip Hitti. And these photographs from the 19-teens and 1920s of his life in Princeton and New York and New England, and also travels to Lebanon, are in the process of being preserved and digitized and should be available soon. And this idea of sharing between institutions. So, Philip Hitti's collection is at the Immigration History Research Center at Minnesota, but we also have some other things from the family. So, it's really great when archives can work together and not see each other as competition. And we work with IHRC in Minnesota on a number of collections that are relevant to us and to their collections. Next slide, please. Other than collecting objects and archival materials from our community, we have a very active oral history program. We have 2 full-time community historians that travel the country and do Zoom interviews. And, we've racked up a few hundred oral histories in the last couple of years that are all available to listen to or watch on our website. And we see this as a very integral part of connecting and collecting stories and creating an archive. A lot of folks in our community ended up in the United States because they were fleeing war or civil strife or humanitarian crisis. And so it's hard to collect objects and photographs from them because they often didn't have any or bring any with them. And so their stories are the most important archive or collection we can get. And so we're always continuing to collect from our community in that way. So the bulk of our materials really do tell about life in the United States, or at least life in transit to the United States and in the U.S. We do have a fair number of materials, from the MENA region, but for the most part, our focus is on Arab Americans. Next slide. We do have some really amazing objects that are very important to the history of the broader MENA region that we're just now further exploring. This is a memory map, which was drawn by a Palestinian refugee in the U.S. named Ahmed Ibrahim, who came here in the 1950s. And this is a very, very detailed and accurate map of his hometown village, Jimsu, in Palestine, which is no longer there. And in addition to this map that he drawn, which is quite large, it takes a special scanner for us to have digitized it. He has a handwritten book. It's about 200 pages telling the entire history of the village and genealogy of all the people that are there. And so we're in the process of digitizing this and making it available because it's a very important piece of history that is not found anywhere else. And so, yeah, that's just a brief overview of our collections and the kinds of things we do. And then just to finish on my piece, the cooperation between our 4 archives. Usually a researcher will contact one of our institutions, the Dearborn Historical Museum, the Bentley Library, EMU's archive, or us, and say, hey, I'm coming to town to look at some things. And whichever institution they contact, we always tell them about the other institutions. Like, hey, while you're in town, if you have a car or feel like taking a short bus ride, you can also go and appreciate all the other archives related in the area. So with that, Alexis, I don't know if you have any final words, but that's all I had.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is even though we're all kind of aware of each other, writing this article was actually the first time any of us had been in the same virtual physical space together, really talking about the collections that we have and the overlap between our materials. So I really appreciate that we were able to have this opportunity to really collaborate, discuss, and think about what the future of collecting in our area is going to look like. So thank you again for having us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt and Alexis. Next up is Ryan Zohar. I don't know if it makes sense for us to maybe if Ryan is ready, or if we should.
Yeah, I'm ready. I just need to get the slides up.
Sure. Thank
But
you.
thank you. Oh Lord, hold on. Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking Professor Hankins and Dr. Ahmed, as well as the entire American Archivist editorial team for all of their support. I also want to thank my fellow panelists for their great presentations and their essays, from which I've learned a great deal. So I want to preface this by saying that my essay that was included in the American Archivist special issue was in part an attempt to develop a practical plan for processing this photography collection called the Colbert Held Archive. But it was also in part a more theoretical effort to wrangle with issues of reparative description, total cost of stewardship, and the unique needs of special libraries. In fact, it sort of especially became this former effort a more theoretical effort, as I'm no longer at the institution that holds this collection, though I was when I actually initially wrote the essay. But the essay engages with the history of American military and infrastructural projects in Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, as well as scholarly literature on photography, travel writing, tourism, as well as archives and power. It also looks at theoretical approaches to thinking around provenance, reparative description, reading archives against the grain, literature on special libraries, and again, the concept of total cost of stewardship. So the Colbert Held Archive consists of 18,000 color Kodachrome slides of photographs taken throughout Colbert Held's time in the region as a diplomat and geographic field researcher. Held worked for more than 20 years in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, and was tasked with taking aerial photographs to serve as the basis for cartographic work undertaken by the U.S. Army Map Service, often in coordination with the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. These photos were donated in 2014 to the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and they include rare aerial shots of strategic sites of the region, but also depict some of the earliest urbanization and development projects in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Dhahran, and Dammam. And they serve as an important documentary repository of social life in the region. Interestingly, the geographic and intelligence-oriented photographs sit alongside one another in the collection and are integrated with the seemingly more banal representations of social life, customs, and the built environment in the region. And you can sort of see that juxtaposition in the two photos here, which I think is representative of the collection more broadly. Many of the collection's photographs feature individuals, some of whom are officials, others are passersby, laborers, or even children at play. So current descriptions as of the time of my writing the article of the archives on the item level include basic metadata, often noting the country, emirate or state, or city where a particular photo was taken, the year a photo was taken, and an item number used to ensure the photos remain in the order they were in Held's collection. A portion of the collection has been digitized, and that's approximately 10%, but the vast majority of the images are only accessible as Kodachrome slides at the current moment. As the collection continues to be processed, digitized, and described by the university's lone archivist / librarian, I should add, more detailed descriptions of the scenes captured by the photographer are added, enriching that item level metadata. So part of this project was accounting for the pace of American military and infrastructural power in the region, as I mentioned, and as well as provenance and Held himself, his positionality. So despite the central focus on Held's photograph as material artifacts, evincing the social history of the region, the role of American entanglements in the Middle East during this period, and how it facilitated the production of such an archive has not really been fully considered, both in descriptions of the archive by the Institute and the metadata itself. So I'd suggest that the commingling of starkly different photographs in the Held archive with no real discernible boundary between them also brings to the fore that which gets included in prior institutional appraisals of this archive. Held's access to these spaces and places on duty, or whether on duty or as a tourist, was always mediated by his position as U.S. government official abroad, which doesn't always get mentioned in work about the archives. And as part of this project, I also engaged with the rich academic literature on photography, which questions the idea of photos as alone being objective representations of reality. Instead, this essay, and I think through some of the examples you can see, suggests that the photos are shaped both by those who are photographed and by the photographer, beyond the frame and behind the lens as well. So I think this is a good example of that, where you sort of get both the gaze that is cast upon those who are photographed, but then also how those who are photographed see Held and what capacity he was in as a U.S. government official affiliated with the U.S. Army Maps Division. This is a photo from the UAE. So this is a photo from Sam Nassad that I found quite helpful to elucidate this point about photography, which is that the photograph, which originates as a product of a special relationship between the photographer and his or her subject, is transformed by virtue of a special relationship between the subject and viewer. These relationships incorporate not only aesthetic considerations, but ideological ones as well. So I think keeping that in mind, we might also look at photos like this, which Held took of a guide in Dhahran while he was deputy chief of mission, and think about how Held's presence and the work that he was involved in transformed the social worlds of individuals such as those who were photographed here. So how do we bring the place of power to the fore in collections like these? As I said, in the essay engaged quite a deal with literature on reparative description or re-description as a model to help render visible the place of power, as well as a method that helps us read things against the grain. And I engage with some of the history of these projects as well. In order to do this, I draw from social histories of the region, some archival documents, as well as Held's own oral history transcripts that detail his involvement in activities during the time that these photographs were taken. I think I looked at two main precedents for projects that do this kind of work, and they do it on the collections level rather than the item level, because item level redescription is not always feasible for special libraries. And the projects that I looked at were the Livingston Online Library, online collection at the University of Maryland Libraries, and the Humanitarian Gaze project, which looks at Jorgen Grin's photography in the Middle East in the 1950s. That collection particularly has a lot of photos of Palestinian refugees, and Palestinian scholars and scholars of Palestine studies have taken these photos and sort of redescribed them in the form of an exhibition rather than an archival collection with the collection level description itself. But still, I thought it was a useful model, and that's at the University of Bergen Library. And I've interspersed a couple of photos from the collection here. So reckoning with challenges in this redescriptive effort, as I mentioned, the Middle East Institute's Oman Library is a very, very small special library at which I formerly served as the sole librarian / archivist. So literature on special libraries, as I'm sure many of you who have worked in special libraries know, there are challenges with regard to staffing, resources, technology, and other frequent limitations. And then if we put this sort of idea in conversation with the OCLC report on total cost of stewardship, we can think about the idea of a capacity restraint. So our limitations for responsibly stewarding collections. And this is a photo of some officials in the Emirates, I believe either in Ajman or Fujairah. So as might be clear by now, there are tensions that exist between different archival responsibilities. So first, the responsibility to swiftly process and make accessible these resources, and this is sort of gets talked about as the more product, less process approach, or MPLP. And the idea that we should thoroughly describe and redescribe material in a way that attends to the place of power and included voices in collections. And that's the idea of reparative description. So I was really inspired by the work of this essay by, I'm forgetting the first name, but de Graaf and Reed in 2021, talking about the reparative process as not something that necessarily requires each item to be redescribed, but something that can work in different scales. So you can start with a collection level redescription, then go either to box level, series level, then item level as resources and technology and staffing permit. So as a result, we moved to a possible solution instead of envisioning an item level redescription project to a collections level one, and then ideally, again, a box level, series level, et cetera. And in order to do that, we studied the National Archives and Records Administration principles for redescription and tried to apply those principles in a proposed plan for the health collection. Now, as I said, I'm no longer at that institution, but I really do hope that that institution continues and moves ahead with this plan. But this plan and sort of this theoretical wrangling with this issue all went into the essay at the American Archivist, and I'm really grateful for the call from Professor Hankins and Dr. Ahmed, as well as their support throughout this process. So I'll just finish by talking a little bit about the writing process. So again, some of the challenges were that by the time it was published, I was no longer at the Middle East Institute, but I still felt that the foundational work for the project, as well as the theoretical framing, were relevant to individuals in the field, maybe beyond the context of this institution. I also thought that the collection's history and visibility was important for scholarship on the Arabian Peninsula and within the field of Arabian Peninsula studies. And I was really grateful for opportunities for support throughout this process. So again, starting with the call for papers from Dr. Ahmed and Professor Hankins, but then I also met extensively with Dr. Ahmed and received constant support, really from the brainstorming process throughout the entirety of the writing, and was able to eventually put this initial work into conversation with some other archival collections, particularly, again, other Western photographic collections of the region that are held at Georgetown University and at NYU Abu Dhabi with similar emphases. So I hope to sort of continue this thinking, even though I'm no longer working with this collection. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I think for the sake of time, we'll try to move on to our last presenter, Dr. Mahdi. And I will be sharing the slides for Dr. Mahdi. If you give me one moment. I just want to make sure everything's there. Okay. So Dr. Mahdi Ganjvi from the University of Toronto, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, and I also I also want to thank both Professor Ahmed as well as Professor Hankins for all the valuable efforts they've put into this special issue. In this presentation, I will first introduce the Amir Hassanpour Funds held at University of Toronto. Next, I will expand on my experience working on appraising, describing, and arranging the Amir Hassanpour Funds at University of Toronto Archives and Records Management Services, UT ARMS, to argue that archiving a diasporic and revolutionary counter-archive calls for more than a procedural and habitual institutional practice. To activate such a counter-archive, there should be first close attention paid to the memory institutions against which the counter-archive has been developed. Such close attention calls for an investigation into the larger political structures in which the memory institutions are embedded. Second, the counter-archive should be understood in the broader modes and methods of cultural and memory and resistance in that specific political structure, engaging analytically and theoretically with the creator's counter-archiving praxis. In this case, Amir Hassanpour's Marxist internationalist revolutionary approach. This presentation will end with a brief discussion of the various ways UT Arms attempted to enliven these specific funds. Next slide. Amir Hassanpour, 1943-2017, was a Kurdish Iranian revolutionary activist and Marxist linguist and a social historian. As a professor, Hassanpour taught at several universities in Canada, including the University of Toronto from 1999 to 2009. His intellectual and historical contributions have impacted Kurdish language studies, theories of nationalism, Kurdish media studies, Kurdish socio-political history, as well as the class analysis of the peasant movement and other social movements in the Middle East. Next slide. Amir Hassanpour Fund is multilingual and predominantly in English, Sorani Kurdish, Persian, and Arabic. This fund documents Hassanpour's professional and personal life, his various research projects, his correspondence with scholars, intellectuals, writers, and political leaders, and his successes in preserving the Kurdish oral, visual, and textual heritage. Next slide, please. Committed to preserving the history of international revolutionary movements and with a vision to establish the discipline of Kurdish studies at University of Toronto, Amir Hassanpour for more than 4 decades actively collected books, pamphlets, journals, musical cassettes and CDs, videos, and ephemera. His investment in the preservation of Kurdish oral, visual, and textual documentary heritage was a response to the historical state suppression of cultural and political struggle of Kurdish people. Kurds are indigenous people of the Mesopotamian plains, totaling approximately 40 million, have their own distinct culture and language and a long history of struggle for national liberation. However, they are dispersed across 4 different countries in the Middle East: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And these Middle Eastern nation states have attempted to rewrite their national histories by erasing the histories, culture, and struggles of the Kurdish people. Next slide, please. The case of the Kurds also represents a unique example of a stateless and suppressed nation, offering a specific lens to examine the role of the national state and social hierarchy in modern archiving. It serves as a case study to understand how the condition of statelessness and national subjugation affects the process of archiving and documentation. Historically, the establishment of modern archival institutions in the Middle East took place within the context of imperialism, colonialism, and nation-state building. The formation and purpose of archival institution cannot be separated from this context. Next slide, please. The case of Iranian Kurds illustrates why the aforementioned national, quotes, institutions could not possibly be inclusive of Kurdish culture, history, and inspirations. For just one example, and I've provided a couple in the article, in 1941, Iran was occupied by Allied forces, and after World War II, the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad, in power from January to December 1946, was established in the northwestern of Iran. However, when Soviet forces began to withdraw from Iran in March 1946, the Iranian state deployed its army to regain full control over the Kurdish provinces. Iran's army defeated the Kurdish government and reestablished centralized control over the region. In simple terms, one of the most prominent Kurdish struggles in the 20th century was crushed by the Pahlavi army. This raises the question, what are the chances of having an inclusive, quote, national, end quote, archives when the process of nation-state building involved the suppression of certain communities, people, and political aspirations. Next slide, please. The nation states in which courts reside, such as Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, have a long history of systematically and actively erasing the history of and culture of Kurdish nationals. Memory institutions have played a significant role in this process as well. Under the aforementioned conditions, community archiving, and personal archives have become important forms of counter-archiving activism, particularly on the internet. Counter-archive is a concept that refers to alternative or subversive forms of archival practice. Counter-archives seek to disrupt dominant power structures and offer alternative ways of remembering, preserving, and accessing information. While archives activism encompasses a broader range of actions and initiatives that seek to promote social change and transformation within archival institutions and practices, counter-archiving is a specific form of archives activism that involves the collection, preservation, and dissemination of materials that are often marginalized or excluded from official archives. Personal counter-archives are personal archives that make previously silenced voices audible. Next slide, please. The case of Amir Hassanpour Funds is an exemplary case of how a personal archive, in this case of Kurdish history, political parties, left groups, and grassroots organizations, can document public life and politics in a way that public records cannot. Amir Hassanpour's archiving practice was fundamentally a method of activism, actively documenting and representing those who are excluded through mechanism of suppression and censorship. He has collected materials that document the works of short-lived social and political groups, the bulletins and flyers published by Kurdish groups and societies in exiles, and many kinds of ephemera. Next slide, please. Many such documents would have easily lost for researchers given the lack of any state-sponsored initiative. The fact that some of the materials Professor Hassanpour gathered were banned in the various countries in which courts reside further helps us understand the importance of his transnational intellectual and political network and his ability to build trust with various communities in acquiring out of print and underground written materials, in exile publications, and clandestine political pamphlets. But how should we activate such an archive? Next slide, please. In their article, From Human Rights to Feminist Ethics, Radical Empathy in the Archives, Caswell and Cypher advocate an ethics of care, which they describe as feminist ethics, to position archivists as caregivers who are responsible for records, creators, subjects, users, and communities. They call for an ethical relationship with records throughout the process of archiving, from appraisal to outreach. They argue that this empathetic approach, grounded in his hospitality, can foster inclusivity in archival interventions. Their call for a social justice agenda in archives emphasizes the need for critical analysis of power, efforts to promote equity in resource allocation and opportunities, advocacy for the inclusion and agency of marginalized individuals and communities in archives, and a reinterpretation of archival concepts to challenge dominant power structures in support of social justice principles and goals. As Campbell discusses in the case of hip-hop archives, archiving the voices of an excluded group should not result in emptying the ethos of their culture. Similarly, to archive a personal counter-archive calls for a close engagement of the archivist to understand the context in which this counter-archive has been developed, and a creative and deep engagement with the creator's archival praxis to understand the vision toward which the counter-archive has been developed. In archiving Amir Hassanpour's personal collection, we were inspired by his Marxist approach to the archives, aiming to incorporate it into archival processing while also adhering to the ethics of care and best practices. In the next slides, yes, if moving back to the previous slide, I will briefly discuss some of the ways UTArms try to enable Amir Hassanpour counter-archiving. First, building relations. In practice, gaining access to a private archive often involves establishing social connections with the individuals. Personal archives have also been the subject of case studies aimed to expanding the field of archiving by focusing on collaborative work with the archive owner, not only concerning traces of the past, but also ongoing lives. I've expanded also how it calls for moving beyond institutional appraisal practice. For instance, in this case, UTArms, which typically just accepts original materials and avoids duplicates or copies, it started to consider the sensitivity of Kurdish historical documents, and our appraisal procedure was expanded to include certain copied materials. Also, Amir Hassanpour was a linguist and directed his attention toward the connection between language and identity. He vehemently criticized the process of language purification and the imposition of monolingual policies, which led to the suppression and in some cases, the eradication of marginalized languages. In response to that and in conversation to that, we produced a multilingual finding aid and preserved it for that. So once we prepared the English finding aid, we were inspired by his vision for preserving multilingual collections, and we became determined that the finding aid should also appear in relevant languages, particularly in Persian and Kurdish, Sorani dialect as two of the languages Hassanpour has used frequently, as well as in Kurmanji as the Kurdish dialect that Hassanpour debated vehemently and successfully that it should become an official language in the Iraq's Kurdistan regional government. Also, in addition to language consideration, our awareness of the geographically dispersed Kurdish diaspora led us to think about how researchers would access the materials. Next slide, please. Digitization serves, and this slide is the first page of the finding aid showing that the finding aid is accessible in all these three languages, and involving four languages, two of which are dialects of Kurdish language. Next slide. And this is another page from the finding aid and how we aimed towards giving access in all these languages. Next slide. This is one of the documents that we also have digitized. And in addition to language considerations, digitization has served not only as a method of dissemination and providing access, but also in the case of materials that have been displaced or are significant to a dispersed community as a form of digital repatriation and the consolidation of materials held across multiple personal funds. However, when digitizing and circulating materials more widely, archivists must consider digital ethics and prioritize people's safety. To conclude, and if we can move to the next slide, through a close examination of the creator's archiving visions and understanding of his archival practice as part of his lifelong intellectual and political struggle against the oppressive forces of imperialism, capitalism, and nationalism, we sought to activate the Amir Hassanpour funds by reinterpreting institutional practices and leveraging the financial resources and intellectual relationships available at UTArms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mehdi. That is the conclusion of our presentations. If there are questions, if there's time for questions, I don't see any in the chat. I know it was disabled for a bit. but it should be enabled. But if there are any questions in the room, perhaps we can take one or two before.
Thank you. I have a question. Can I hear me? Okay. I have a question probably to Matt, or anybody can answer this question. I just wonder how present the Yemeni community within your archives. Because in Michigan, the biggest Yemeni community in the United States is in Michigan. So I just wonder. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, our collections are not the community as we would like, and we are a national institution, but we do have deep roots in Metro Detroit. We have lots of oral histories from the Yemeni community. We do not have as deep archival collection, and that's something that we're working on. We don't have any objects, but yeah. So thank you for that. It is something we're aware that we just have not been that good as an institution at making sure everybody's represented in the museum.
And I'm sorry, there's a follow-up question. Maybe Matt, you can answer. We're in the chat asking about outreach activities, particularly by the Arab American Archives, or any kind of archival outreach that you all do.
Yeah, one thing we've been doing for the last 2 years is working with high school students, to mainly Arab and MENA high school students, who come in and we teach them how they can preserve their own family history, photographs, digital materials, doing oral histories with their own family. We're really trying to activate the community as a source of preserving their own family stories.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
Well, if there's no further questions, well, thank you all for hosting us. We hope to, as you can see, this is a very rich field. There's a lot to be said about archives, living archives in the region, and we hope that there'll be more opportunities to publish and talk about them in the future. So thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.